Hi guys, so I'm scheduled to do my video today. I'm doing it today. I just want to make a quick comment about Carrie Fisher passed away earlier today, or the news about it was released earlier today, I think. She had gone into the hospital with cardiac arrest on the 23rd. Seemed to have been improving earlier this week, and then she suddenly passed. For Star Wars fans, this raises some questions about, the future of the franchise. But first and foremost, just want to pray for her family, her loved ones, and everyone who will be grieving and missing her. And she's most commonly known for the part of Leia. I think that almost goes without saying. Perhaps to a lesser degree, she was known as a comedian and a writer. I mean, a lot of the things that she wrote about, and even her comedy routines, still end up relating to her personal experience of being involved in the Star Wars franchise. And because those were huge aspects for life, being such large franchises that has incredible impact on the continuation of her career and everything. So anyway, Star Wars is not like something I would normally want to talk about. This it would be way too easy for me to geek out on a lot of science fiction things on this channel, but I do want to try to stay focused on fairy tales, and of course, Cinderella is like the big one that we're doing this year and next year, but I do want to be branching out into other fairy tale type things. And Star Wars is commonly called and recognized as a fairy tale in space. And that does lead us into our topic for today that I had scheduled, which is the question of what makes a fairy tale a fairy tale. And this might not seem like a difficult question for some people, like whatever, but I remember when I was a kid, I had in my mind very specific concepts of what constituted a fairy tale and what wasn't. And the movies like Shrek or other things that like were supposed to be a hodgepodge of several fairy tales happen, and there'd be things that popped up in there that I felt like didn't really belong if you're truly doing a fairy tale movie. For example, the Gingerbread Man. I just never really thought of that as being a fairy tale. Or Mother Goose. It just was different. Like, to me, there are children's stories and there are fairy tales. Like, fairy tales are a subgenre of folklore, and some of that falls into kids' stories, but not all of it. Now, that was just my way of categorizing things when I was younger. As I've gotten older, I realized that's not always how things are categorized. Fairy tales do have certain tropes. Disney, of course, with their animated fairy tales and literature adaptations and stuff as movies, I think they help blur that line a little bit between different forms of literature and fairy tales, since they did a wide range between their Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, Beauty and the Beast, and those kind of tales, and then you have Jungle Book and Tarzan. Now, of course, Tarzan and Jungle Book, these are things based on actual, like, novels and pulp fiction, not really fairy tales. And even story-wise, you won't find a whole lot of similarities other than that they do have elements of adventure and they do have elements of romance, but that, doesn't necessarily make it a fairy tale. So if you're looking up real quick the definition of fairy tale, and Google, when you look up words, they give like the definition real quick, and she says, noun, a children's story about magical and imaginary beings and lands. Well, that would make Peter Pan a fairy tale, wouldn't it? Even though Peter Pan was a play. And it was written a little bit later than what you would normally consider like most fairy tales, and a little older than that. Wikipedia's definition gets a little more specific on what kind of magical creatures. It says a fairy tale is a type of short story that typically features folkloric fantasy characters, such as dwarves, elves, fairies, giants, gnomes, goblins, mermaids, trolls, unicorns, or witches, and usually magic or enchantments. Now, this doesn't say it absolutely has to have these elements to be a fairy tale. It just says usually. So this brings to my mind things like, well, Little Red Riding Hood. There's no magic in Little Red Riding Hood. Certainly in the version where she cuts the wolf's stomach, or the woodsman cuts the wolf's stomach and rescues Red and the grandmother, that's not something that would actually happen in real life. And so you might say, well, it contains kind of a supernatural phenomenon, or breaks the laws of physics, or whatever. It's just not something that would really, really happen. But if you had a version where somehow she tricks the wolf, where instead of getting eaten herself, then there's not supernatural. Oh wait, the wolf talks, so that is strange. I mean, it's not necessarily magic, is it? But talking animals, and I have seen definitions where it includes talking animals, but that's not listed here. I am rambling. Okay, but since it does say it has features folkloric fantasy characters, what is the difference between a fairy tale and folklore? Folklore, and my printer's out, so what's the difference? I don't think you can ask people at Semantics to do that, but they don't just do what's the difference between any subject, but books versus movies. Sorry. As soon as I said, what's the difference? I had to think of them. Okay. So A to Z teacher stuff. It's kind of a handy website. I've seen other things on their website having to do with fairy tales and folklore. So these have to be the experts. I gotta have the answer to this question. What's the real difference between folklores and fairy tales? What's the best way to discuss it with second graders? Now this is a teacher's forum, so you're going to have a few different takes on this. Folk tales and fairy tales are very different and very similar. Folk tales usually contain exaggeration and often an animal dressed and acting like a human. There is usually a lesson, although that is also the purpose of fables. And see, that's another thing with like the Shrek and stuff. I felt like a lot of the stuff in there, you could call it a folklore, you could call it a fable, definitely a fable, but not necessarily a fairy tale. But back to this response. Fairy tales were not originally for children. Real fairy tales are very dark and scary and violent. Therefore, children adore them if they're allowed to experience them uncensored. I love Disney, but that studio really knows how to diminish a good story. Yeah, and that's part of the reason why we're going to have the Disney trials. I know, this is like a total side note, but for me the Disney trials isn't really so much about the feminist shticks and complaints about Disney animated films, but for me it's more of, as somebody who loves fairy tales and folklores, the way they distorted the stories and the source materials and dummy things down so terribly, especially Cinderella. Oh my goodness. Their animated Cinderella was really painful to go back and rewatch. But I digress. I do think it's interesting that she said that, and something I remember reading a long time ago. I got a book. It was about this thick. This isn't the exact book, but like seriously, I had a book this thick once, and it was a collection of like just Beauty and the Beast stories, and it's retellings. And oh my goodness, one of the things that came out was that the Beauty and the Beast fairy tales were originally told for adults by adults as pastime. On the subject of Cinderella, the Japanese Lady Ochikobomo is originally it was told in the court, you know, for the royal folk gathered there in Japan for entertainment for the adults, and it was one of those stories that was told and just added to, and I know I'm not describing it right, but kind of like Arabian Nights, where somebody's just they start telling a story and it goes on and goes on and goes on, and the Japanese Cinderella novel is like that, and then it's kind of cool. I really need to get a hold of the English translation again. So I don't know. I'm not gonna draw like definitive conclusions on this. But in my mind, fairy tales were told during a certain time period. A lot of the stories that we recognize as fairy tales were compiled in books in the mid 1700s to early 1800s, and a lot of those books were just translations of earlier books, and like I said, they're just they're compilations, and they would like change, you know, get a couple of stories from this book and a few stories from this book and a few stories here and translate them and put them together. And actually the concept of Mother Goose comes from a title of one such book that collected fairy tale stories. And as much as I complain about Disney butchering of fairy tales, I do have to acknowledge that one reason why we have so many different versions of Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, and whatnot is because people, they did retell it. They would tweak with some details here and there. With the Beauty and Beast set, it seems like it was much more purposeful. You had a very simple formula, and different writers at the time, they would orally tell these stories to one another, and it seems like they were trying to top one another who could tell the story better. That's the impression I get from just like the massive collection, and they turned up relatively close to one another. It's not like Beauty and the Beast is a story that's found all over the place and was retold and changed to languages the same way that Cinderella was. It has a very different, what you call, cycle to it, as far as the history and development of the story goes. I had some books specifically on the subject on hold. Unfortunately, of the ton of books I did get, that's not one I got on time. Next month for the nonfiction, I'm going to discuss Cinderella cycles, and I got a couple of books on that from the library, which I'm looking forward to, and I actually started skimming through, and yet that's for next month, so I'm sorry being underprepared. Things have been kind of frustrating trying to figure out what I'm going to do with all this technology and get it fixed so I can record things in a more timely manner to stick with that schedule. So this is the last week of this month, so I decided I'm going to do 2 big videos. I pre-recorded one video already that's going to be a special surprise later this week. Friday night, I have an extra video series I want to do. I want to watch like 3 or 4 different fantasy stories to review and talk about, and just watch those back to back on Friday night. And then Saturday for New Year's, be sticking to my marathon of Warner Brothers whatever you call it, if it's for quadrilogy of contemporary Cinderella stories. And I'm looking forward to all those. On one hand, I've tried to balance the contemporary tales and the other kind of fairy tales, whether it's historical or really in a fantasy world. Fridays, I'm really excited to watch Fridays. Originally, I wasn't going to do this, but I saw this video that just really got me thinking. I was at Walmart and I was looking through the $5 video bin, and I saw something and like, oh, hey, that's cool, and it reminded me of some other videos that was made about that time period, fantasy movies. And I remember seeing some of those closer to the time when they came out, the others a little later. So I'm going to do about 4 videos on Friday night, watching them back to back, and I'll do previewing reactions and then my post reaction, and then watch the next movie, and same thing. So but they're going to be fantasy movies. Could these be considered contemporary fairy tales? Is Star Wars really a fairy tale in space? I don't know. In my mind, a fairy tale, like I said, fits has like a historical setting as far as when the story develops and such. But a lot of people write a modern fairy tale. Never mind that the 1700s and 1800s were during the modern era, but whatever. I know the word modern just doesn't have the same historical meaning that it once did. It's used very loosely these days. But Star Wars certainly takes some cues from fairy tales, and some of the way that fairy tales take cues from mythology. There's some, they're not the exact same things, but they're kind of related in a certain way. I'm rambling and I lost my thought. Oh, fantasy. Yeah, so can you tell a fantasy story? Is it automatically a fairy tale too? No, not really. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and kind of bend things a little bit and not just stick to fairy tales, but talk about some fantasy movies. This video is probably absolutely horrendous and I should probably re-record it, but I don't have enough battery life on my tablet, so thank you for watching this. If you have watched it, please stay tuned as I try to collect my thoughts better next